Boa tarde, meu nome é Joel, eu sou professor da Universidade Federal Fluminense e também pesquisador associado da Monash University na Austrália. E eu estou aqui para apresentar outro pesquisador da Monash, que é o professor Neil Selwyn. É um professor inglês que veio para a Monash faz uns 6 anos agora. E ele é mais conhecido para suas críticas aos discursos mais otimistas, mais ingênuas sobre tecnologias e educação. A carreira dele é realmente em função do investimento pesado nas tecnologias dentro das escolas e depois de projetos de avaliação do retorno sobre esse investimento. E ele é alguém que participou muito dessas avaliações e na Austrália também continua fazendo isso. E ele torna como objeto de análise as nossas próprias teorias que usamos para entender o papel das tecnologias. E ele destaca principalmente os interesses do capitalismo neoliberal nas apropriações das novas tecnologias na escola. E ele tem um pensamento sobre esse movimento do neoliberalismo global. Mas a minha contribuição para problematizar ainda mais um pouco esse cenário é de pensar como que a globalização também é uma visão ideológica também de como são as relações entre países, entre grupos sociais, que oculta também outras dimensões. E penso muito nisso na questão das teorias de multiletramentos, que são centrais ao JELT, desde a primeira edição, que eu fui aluno da American Lances e eu me reconheci muito na análise de diversidade cultural que é proposta pelo New London Group. E depois, quando vi o uso dos mesmos textos no contexto brasileiro, que eu entendi que diversidade cultural tinha outro sentido, outra dinâmica, que eu comecei a pensar que realmente esse movimento não é tão uniforme, não é global, não é uma integração do mesmo jeito que eles imaginavam em 94, juntando aquele pessoal em New London. Assim, eu vou então passar para a gente assistir o vídeo para encerrar a nossa jornada e depois alguém vai fazer um agradecimento, imagino. Você, Cláudia? Tá bom, então, obrigado.
So hello everybody and thanks for taking the time to listen to this talk. Claudia asked me if I would like to speak today around the theme of discourse, and I think the theme of discourse is a perfect lens through which to try and explore the topic of education and technology. So let me try and explain why. Firstly, if you're not familiar with my work, then it's worth stating that I do not consider the use of technology in education to be a neutral or a naturally beneficial process. Instead, I like to argue that the use of digital technology in education is a site of struggle and a site of intense conflict. Now, these are struggles that take place across a number of fronts, from the allocation of resources and the maximisation of profit to concerns with epistemology or equality of education opportunity. So as such, I think many of the key issues that underpin education and digital technology are actually fundamentally political questions that are asked continually of education and society. For example, questions of what education is, questions of what education should be. So in these senses, developing a proper understanding of the educational application of digital technology can only come from recognition of broader issues of power and control and conflict and resistance. So put bluntly, any account of digital technology use in education needs to be framed in explicit terms of societal conflict over the distribution of power. So this brings us to the focus of this talk, approaching digital education as discourse. Now, I'm increasingly convinced that the discursive construction of digital education is critical to the whole venture of educational technology. Now, the area of educational technology is notorious for its excessive and its slippery use of language. Think of the talk that we hear all the time about digital disruption or 21st century schools, personalised learning, School 2.0, the flipped classroom. This is an area of education that's bogged down in hyperbole and hubris. Now, besides from attempting to try and persuade relevant stakeholders of the legitimacy, visibility and value of digital products and processes and practices, these discourses play a really important part, but a really unnoticed part, in squaring circles and rationalising often contradictory perspectives, motivations and goals. And these discourses play a really important role in enrolling the popular consent of actually quite sceptical practitioners and general public. So I believe that carefully studying the discourses that have been employed and teasing out the contradictions and the fault lines and the recurring themes within can provide us with far richer insights into the growing place of digital technology and media within education than is possible just through analysing education practice alone. So I've long been fascinated by the language used to describe technology use in education, and I'd like to encourage you to take a moment to do the same. So perhaps during the course of this conference, you might like to keep your ears open for the discursive constructions of education and technology that you come across. So instead of rolling your eyes when you hear talk of digital natives or smart schools and similar buzzwords, try and think further about how this rhetoric relates to a host of important questions. So here are some really interesting questions to ask about the discourses and the discursive construction of education and technology. So what are the meanings and the understandings of education that are being conveyed through portrayals of digital technology? Whose interests do these understandings and meanings work? What extent are these constructions of digital technology situated within dominant structures of production and power? What freedoms and restrictions are being associated with such statements? How are these likely to be experienced by different individuals, different social groups? And how do these discourses frame the relationships between the individual and the commons and the public and the private? Now, these are all really interesting and really important questions to ask. And as soon as you start tuning into the language of education and technology in this way, then you soon get to see the inherent political nature of education and technology. For example, you quickly notice how conversations about EdTech often work to define education problems and define their solutions. These are discourses that contain a number of seductive and convincing propositions. In other words, statements about education and statements about how education works. They contain a number of very convincing presuppositions. So we treat certain propositions as given, and they contain very kind of convincing interpersonal functions. So discourses about how relationships between people in education take place. So while these discourses might vary in the degree to which they perceive and present the reformation of existing education arrangements, I like to argue that they sustain a general common sense, a kind of general orthodoxy around the nature and the form of what education in the digital age should be. So these are discourses that reinforce the imperative of technological change in education. And these are discourses that lead us to presume that the digital realignment and the digital reconfiguration of education is inevitable, and that the only questions that we need to ask concerns the extent to these changes. These are all things I think we need to challenge. Now, I've spent the past 20 years trying to step back from the common sense orthodoxy of EdTech and challenge the language of education and technology. And if you do this, you can uncover underpinning values and agendas within these discursive currents. Now, having done this in my own research over the past 20 years or so, I think there's a number of distinctive discursive traits that seem to recur regardless of the specific technology and regardless of the specific sector of education. Now, I'd be really interested to see whether these apply to the South American context and whether these apply to the very specific area of ELT. I suspect that they might, although I'm also sure that there will be variations and perhaps additional issues at play in your own particular fields of work. But anyway, from my experience at least, these issues include the following 9 themes. I think perhaps the most prominent value throughout the discursive construction of education technology that I've noticed over the past 20 years relates to the individualization of practice and action. Now, many EdTech discourses that you come across involve an increased responsibility of the individual in terms of making choices with regards to education, as well as dealing with the consequences of these choices. So we're told, for example, how digital education demands increased levels of self-dependence, entrepreneurial thinking on the part of the individual, with education success dependent primarily on the individual's ability to self-direct their ongoing engagement with learning through various preferred forms of digital technology. Secondly, alongside this individualisation of action is the idea of education as an area of increased informalisation and risk. So in this way, digital technologies seem to support various forms of learning that could be said to be indeterminate and fragmented and uncertain and fluid and risky. And moreover, the informal nature of this way of engaging with education is usually assumed to work in favour of the individual and at the expense of self-interested formal education institutions. So unwittingly or not, digital education is presented as a ready means through which informal and disorganised sensibilities are internalised as norms and values by education in institutions as well as by individuals. A third prominent value, I think, is the reframing of educational concerns along less collective lines. So here we're told that we're unencumbered now by the need to learn with those in our immediate context or our locality. We're told that education technologies make it easier to interact and learn with other people of our own choice. The so-called communities of learners that can be established through these digital technologies differ considerably in terms of social diversity, obligation, solidarity and underlying structures of power, but we're told that this doesn't matter because these are the people and the ways that we've chosen to learn. I've also been struck over the past 20 years by the way that many EdTech discourses frame learning as a competitive endeavour. Now this contradicts the presentation of digital education as allowing individuals to learn harmoniously with others, and instead we're often told that digital technology places individuals in personal formative cycles and individual feedback loops. So individuals learn with technology to become industrious self-improvers, driven by external goals and striving to improve their own performance in comparison with others. Now, it won't be a surprise to many people that have seen the boon of the EdTech marketplace over the past 20 years to see that another value that underpins the discourses of digital education over the past 20 years is the promotion of free market values and free market sensibilities as the preferred mechanism of educational organisation. So on one hand, many forms of digital education are presented as supporting rational market exchange as the dominant framework for organising and regulating educational interaction and exchange. But also on the other hand, these discourses increasingly support and valorise the overt monetarisation and commercialisation of educational provision within for-profit marketplaces. Following on from this, it's also noticeable how many of the discourses around EdTech often promote the reconfiguration of education in a commodity state. So in other words, they frame education processes and practices in market forms of something that has calculable and quantifiable value and something that can therefore be exchanged. Now it seems clear that one of the values implicit in the dominant discourses of digital education is the reconfiguration of educational practices and relations into forms that can be quantified and exchanged, that can be bought and can be sold. Now this leads on to a seventh value, which I think is also implicit, and that's the increasing valuing of privatisation through the digitisation of education. So in particular, these are discourses that tend to implicate the enhanced importance of commercial actors as education providers. So in fact, one of the clear outcomes of many forms of digital education is the reconstitution of education into forms that are reductible, quantifiable and ultimately contractable and outsourced out to various actors outside of the traditional education community. An eighth theme is that the ways in which all these discourses also imply an increased expansion of education into unfamiliar areas of society and social life. So we're often told about how technology leads to an always-on state of potential educational engagement. So EdTech discourses often tend to support the expansion of education and learning into domestic, community and work settings. And there are really interesting parallels here with what Basil Bernstein identified as the total pedagogization, very difficult word to say, of society. So in other words, a modern society that ensures that pedagogy is integrated into all possible spheres of life. And finally, it's really interesting how a lot of these points reflect to correspondences between digital technology and the altered emotional states of educational engagement. So in particular, we're led to accept that digital education involves teaching and learning being experienced on less immediate, less intimate and perhaps more instrumental grounds. From this perspective, we're led to accept that digital education is something that can be experienced on a partial, segmented, task-orientated, fragmented and discontinuous basis. We're told about education being unbundled and consumed in a way that's equivalent to how one would consume a television series on Netflix. Now, I'm sure a lot of these discourses will be familiar to lots of you that have followed education technology during your careers. And if any of them are not, it might be worth looking to see whether you can find examples of them in the discourses that you come across on a daily basis. Now, whether you agree specifically with any of my interpretations or not, I hope it's clear that the current discourses of digital education disguise a number of significant conflicts and tensions that need to be fully acknowledged and addressed. Now, of course, these apparent contradictions should not be assumed automatically as cause for concern. There are many people, after all, who might be advantaged by more individualised or elitist or competitive or market-driven, omnipresent and de-emotionalised forms of education engagement. It's important not to see these things as automatically as a bad thing. Yet my concern is perhaps that many of these values perhaps don't sit easily with the traditional values and desires of public education. Education as a public good rather than a private interest. And I think certainly many of the most popular current forms of digital education and the discourses that surround them align readily with values and agendas of what has been noted elsewhere as a neoliberal turn within education provision. So in other words, these are values and agendas of profit, decreased state and government involvement, and the need to satisfy the requirement of post-industrial capitalism. So at best, I'm concerned that these current dominant constructions of digital education do little to challenge or disrupt prevailing individualisation, commodification and privatisation of contemporary education. And conversely, there's far less in the discourses of education technology that actively promotes positive concerns of, say, social justice, inequality and the notion of education as a collective public good. Now, these silences may or may not constitute a problem, but I think alternate agendas and perspectives at least deserve to be foregrounded more readily within the dominant discourses around education and digital technology. So while it's difficult to identify easy solutions to all of the predicaments I've just pointed to, I think there are some modest means through which these tensions might begin to be expressed. So above all is, I think, is the need for people like us at conferences like this to explore ways of altering the ways in which education and technology is talked about. For example, we might like to stimulate vigorous ongoing public debates around public education and digital technology. This might lead to reframings of education as and digital technology as a public controversy. This might allow current common sense understandings of digital education to be challenged, to be contested, to be problematized. Similarly, we need to ask questions about how we might encourage academic writers and researchers to problematize digital education, to engage in discussions and debates that move beyond the celebratory nature of much of the scholarly work on digital media and education, and better demonstrate the links between the various types of dominance and inequality that are inherent in current forms of digital education. Above all then, how can we encourage many people's interactions with digital education in conscious terms and explicit terms of power and ideological conflict? Now, these are all very important challenges for those of us looking to make a difference in the world of EdTech. Language is clearly a key element to improve the conditions of education and technology. So I think we need to be much more mindful of the words that are used and the ways in which they are used in conferences like this when we're talking about digital education. So we need to think about ways about talking about more frequently and forcibly about education and technology in ways that foreground issues such as democracy and public value, the common good, morals and ethics. We need to be much more forward-looking in the way that we challenge the buzzwords and the taglines that distort discussions of education and technology. And we need to be much more confident in calling out lazy generalizations and outright hyperbole. And I think above all, conferences like this and academics working in the area of education and technology need to put much more of a focus on collectively minding our language when it comes to talking about education and technology in the future. Digital education is as much about discourse as it is about devices, and I think it's time that we properly scrutinise what's being said in this field and also think about better ways of saying it. So thanks very much.
Então, eu passo a palavra à professora Cláudia Rocha e como é que ela vai fazer, vou falar por última, já agradecer a organização dela, ela que é a principal responsável do evento de hoje. Parabéns, Cláudia.
Agradeço, viu, Jô? Gente, eu queria, na verdade, nesse encerramento, só reiterar essas palavras de agradecimento, principalmente aqueles que puderam ficar até o final. A gente vai buscar compartilhar o vídeo com vocês através da nossa página. Infelizmente, a gente não teve condições de trazer o Neil para cá, mas a gente vai conseguir. Eu queria agradecer toda a equipe. Na verdade, eles fazem muito mais do que eu. Eles estão trabalhando arduamente para que esse evento aconteça. E, então, eles têm toda a minha admiração e eterna gratidão. Obrigada a todos vocês e espero que vocês tenham gostado do evento. Tá? Até a próxima JELT, a quinta. Vem aí. Tchau.